Good morning, everyone. This is Stephanie Bolus, and I work here in the Office of Training and Exercises at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, and we are pleased to welcome all of you to this morning's webinar, RCPT Housing Strategy Framework. Due to the number of callers, we will be muting all participant lines during the session, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please do ask them. We just ask that you do so via the chat feature. Simply type them in and they will be answered in the same format. If you would rather ask your questions or make comments verbally, we ask that you hold these until Erica takes a break for questions or until the end. I will ask you to raise your hand using the Raise Your Hand button located directly below the list of participants. I will then recognize you individually and ask that you unmute your line using *6. At the end, there will be an opportunity to provide feedback via a link to include suggestions for questions for the RCPT Framework Housing Workshop. And we very much appreciate you taking the time to do so. This session will be recorded, and a link will be provided to all registered participants to view the recorded session. Now to introduce our presenter for today, Ms. Erica Bernstein. Ms. Bernstein is the Regional Liaison for VDIM's Regions 1 and 5. Over the past year and a half, Erica has worked closely with the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning Team to develop exercises and coordinate training needs in support of their regional exercises. Erica began working the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning Team in July 2013 when they kicked off the training and exercise portions of their RCPG program. She served as the workshop and webinar project manager for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management Office of Training and Exercises. Her past experiences with the VDIM training includes assisting in development courses, objectives, course materials, and activities for the delivery of workshops, seminars, and webinars on emergency management and preparedness topics. Erica earned her master's degree in Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2012. Take it away, Erica.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank all of you for attending today's workshop. I really think this webinar is going to be a good introduction prior to the housing workshop. Like Stephanie said, we will be sending out a link to the recorded webinar, and we're also going to send out the PDF version of the PowerPoint as well as the framework document, just in case you don't actually have a copy of the document prior to the workshop. I hope to keep the webinar around about an hour. There is a lot to cover, so do bear with me on some of those slides that tend to be a little bit longer. To start off, I'd like to discuss some of our goals for today. First, we'd like to have you guys familiar with the Regional Catastrophic Framework, which is the document that we use to help form the ideas and topics for the housing workshop. And a lot of the aspects of the housing workshop workbook that you'll be receiving a copy of on May 14th has a lot of information pulled from this framework document. Today I'm also going to give a brief overview and history of the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning process and what the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team has completed so far. I know a few of you are part of that process, but for those who haven't been or are new to it, we'd like to just kind of let you guys know what we've done. I'm also going to provide a few reference links that might be beneficial to review prior to the housing workshop. The National Disaster Recovery Framework and some links from HUD are going to be explored in further detail during our Bridging the Gap Between Private and Public Resources panel, but there are some links that if you want to kind of get a head start, you can. Okay, the webinar objectives for today are to give you the basic understanding of the purpose, organization, key concepts of the Housing Strategy Framework, along with some tools outside of the framework. I will be breaking throughout the presentation for questions, and I'll take questions at the end as well. You can use the chat feature that you see on your screen. I'll do my best to answer questions as I see them pop up, but Stephanie's online in case there's any that I miss we can address at the end. Please keep in mind that this webinar we're discussing the housing recovery in context of the RCPT Housing Strategy Framework. Clearly there are a lot of other plans and policies and different funding and programs that we can't cover in this hour, and a lot of great information is going to be presented at the housing workshop. So if you haven't registered for that, make sure you have, and I'll show that link at the end as well. And Stephanie mentioned this, at the end of the webinar we're going to have a survey. You also probably potentially received an email on Friday regarding the survey where we're asking everyone to submit any housing-related questions. We're going to be sending any of these questions to the speakers so that they have a heads up, so that they can be prepared to address these either through their presentations or during the question and answer sessions of each panel. Okay, so the regional catastrophic housing strategy that we are going to discuss today draws from disaster housing best practices and lessons learned from across the United States and from the documents listed above. The framework was prepared under the Regional Catastrophic Planning Grant from the Federal Emergency Management Agency's grant programs within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So now I'm going to give you the brief history of the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team and where they are today for those who aren't familiar with this initiative in the Hampton Roads. Shown is the map of the 24 jurisdictions that comprise the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team in Southeast Virginia and Northeast North Carolina region. During Phase 1, they added additional Virginia and North Carolina localities. The RCPT chose 3 planning scenarios. They chose a Category 3 hurricane, an aerosolized anthrax attack, and a multiple improvised explosive device attack to focus their training and exercises around. During Phases 1 and 2, there was quite a few work products developed, included the evacuation scenario analysis, traffic modeling report, and a mass evacuation annex. The major regional catastrophic frameworks and annexes were developed during Phase 2. And then during Phase 3, they really focused on the planning for sheltering, logistics, and disaster housing. Several studies, including the behavioral study and shelter study, were completed, along with several strategies, including the Regional Catastrophic Housing Strategy that we are discussing today. 14 job aids were developed during Phase 3, including a staging area field operations guide, an emergency manager coordinator handbook. And then Phase 4 began in August of 2014, and today we're into Phase 5. These 2 phases really focused on the training and exercise aspects of the Regional Catastrophic Planning Grant. We've delivered, prior to this webinar, we've delivered classroom trainings on the 3 frameworks on the hurricane, IED, and anthrax. And then since August of 2014, the Regional Catastrophic Team has been really busy planning and participating in exercises that include 4 tabletops and 1 functional exercise. And these are just some of the courses. These are additional trainings that were provided in the region in support of their exercise process and in support of the planning grant. Again, this is the continuance of courses. There was regional courses that included several event-specific trainings along with additional webinars online. We also partnered with the Virginia Department of Health to provide additional trainings in support of the RCPT exercises. An additional RCPT event included the Getting It Right workshop, which occurred in February. This provided tools and information to emergency managers, lawyers, disability organizations, and stakeholders, as well as advocates who really seek to improve resources and services to older Virginians, Virginians with disabilities, and their families. The workshop encouraged full integration and inclusion in all aspects of emergency preparedness and response. The last exercise of the RCPT process will be on May 14th, which is the Housing Recovery Workshop. And we're also in the process of updating several of the frameworks and annexes based on the after-action reports that have come out of each of the prior exercises. Okay, and so the framework document is really intended to serve as a comprehensive reference for the Hampton Roads region, the state of North Carolina, and the Commonwealth of Virginia, with information related to the planning for and executing interim and long-term recovery following a catastrophic disaster. I really am trying to place an emphasis on the word framework to ensure that everyone understands that this is not a plan, and also this framework really lends itself to a catastrophic event. The document is not meant to reflect on issues regarding immediate post-event activity known as sheltering, and housing recovery decisions following a disaster are a local prerogative, and the success of which depends upon resources and programs coming from outside the region and other levels of government. The framework is organized to allow local jurisdictions to understand the overall context of federal and state resources and programs that will be the backdrop against which local housing recovery will take place. So included in the framework, the Housing Strategy Framework includes several detailed templates that can be used by local jurisdictions, both pre- and post-event. This will match unique housing recovery needs of their jurisdictions with the range of possible solutions that can be applied to those needs. The framework provides the basis of development of an action plan that describes the needs, strategies, and projected uses of disaster recovery funds. The framework also includes relevant authorities, roles, and responsibilities for housing recovery and planning at all levels of government. And the framework is intended to create a common understanding of housing recovery phases that can be used as a basis for development of integrated state, regional, and local housing recovery plans. So overall, the framework provides a basic roadmap for strategies, approaches, critical decision points, and available resources that are part of the housing recovery process. And so the purpose of the strategy is providing emergency managers and officials with concepts and practices to guide them on responding to short-term and long-term disaster housing needs resulting from the 3 catastrophic scenarios. Again, those were a Category 3 hurricane, a multiple improvised explosive device incident that occurs in the region, and an aerosolized anthrax dispersal that affects not only the region, but also potentially those people that have come in contact and have left the area. Okay, so the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning Team agreed to pursue a new modeling effort that sought to replicate the conditions of the Superstorm Sandy. Please understand that this is just one set of modeling data, but for the purpose of the workshop, we will be using this data that's in the framework. So the slide you'll see now and 2 slides from now, everyone will have a copy of those on their locality tables. So we just want everyone to know that while other people might work from different data sets, this is the one we will be using for the workshop. As you probably know, Superstorm Sandy was the deadliest and most destructive tropical storm of the 2012 hurricane season, and it is considered the second costliest hurricane in United States history. Sandy was a Category 3 hurricane at its peak intensity when it made landfall with Cuba, while it was a Category 2 storm off the coast of northeastern U.S. The storm became the largest Atlantic hurricane on record as measured by diameter, with wind spans 1,100 miles and on average produced 13-foot storm surges. A model of Superstorm Sandy slamming through the greater Hampton Roads region was created. Housing damage, economic impacts, and displaced population from the winds were determined using the HAZUS 2.1 program. Marginal wind impacts and inundation analysis demonstrated that the flooding impact of the storm scenario would be catastrophic. So I moved through that information pretty quickly. Does anyone have any questions at this point regarding the framework or any of the history? You can use your little raise the hand button if you do. Okay, so moving forward, so I want to talk a little bit about the definition of financial vulnerability prior to the next slide. The next slide will show a screenshot of the displaced population by vulnerability, which is owner versus renters. This data was developed through the vulnerability analysis by household for the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning Grant member jurisdictions. That's a mouthful, which defines financial vulnerability as a forecast of a household's inability to absorb the financial impact of a disrupting severe storm event on the normal daily routines of the household. VMask, who did the analysis, took 5 indicators which were taken together to characterize what would comprise a household's financial vulnerability. So no one indicator is going to be more important than the other. So a weighting system is assigned to each one prior to turning it into the financial scale. These 5 indicators include: does anyone in the household lose pay? Does anyone in the household lose vacation time or use sick time? If they were to lose a week's pay, would they have trouble paying the next month's rent or mortgage? And if they lose a month's pay, would they have trouble paying the next month's rent or mortgage? Then does the household have enough cash or credit to support them for 5 days outside of the region? Okay, so you're probably wondering how they came up with this data. Following Irene, selected households were queried on which of the weighted indicators, or on each of the weighted indicators that we just discussed. Then those were combined in the financial vulnerability scale. The scale is converted to 10-point range, with 10 indicating a really high financial vulnerability and 1 indicating a really low. So the distinctions among 1 being low, 2 being medium, and 3 being high categories are determined by taking the natural breaks within the data. So the columns here represent the displaced populations in raw numbers based on housing damage, largely from water surge and some from modest wind. These homes are located in neighborhoods that were identified as low, medium, or high financial vulnerability, as we just discussed. These displaced population numbers are then listed under each one as low, medium, or high. The population numbers are then further broken down by either owner-occupied or renter-occupied. Does anyone have any questions on the financial vulnerability or the chart? Okay, great. Okay, we're going to go into more detail on the phases of disaster housing in the next few slides, but first I wanted to show a picture of the different phases in the context of the housing strategy framework. So while this document doesn't go into details regarding sheltering, the framework does define the term shelter as shelters are facilities designated to support and house evacuees in the event of a natural or human-caused disaster. These shelters can be configured to accommodate the short-term or long-term needs of evacuees and incorporate equal opportunity for people with disabilities. They provide provisions, food, water, basic first aid, pet sheltering, sleeping areas, and disaster support services. The number and type of services that may be provided will vary depending upon the available resources, the needs of each jurisdiction, and the nature of the event. The duration of sheltering activities for a community will depend on the severity and nature of the disaster. In ideal cases, community sheltering should last no longer than 2 weeks. However, in catastrophic conditions, sheltering may extend up to 60 days. Regardless of the duration, it is important to understand that sheltering is the first stepping stone towards returning to one's home. The Commonwealth of Virginia and the Department of Social Services has established 30 days as the goal for the closure of any state-managed shelter following their initial post-disaster occupancy. So in recent large-scale and catastrophic disasters, FEMA has implemented 2 new housing strategies that fall between the shelter phase and the interim housing phase. These transitional housing strategies allow survivors to move from congregate shelters to either a motel or hotel or even to their own personal residence. They are transitional in the sense that while the living condition created by these strategies is not sustainable for an extended period, they are an improvement upon the congregate living shelter conditions. FEMA may provide transitional shelter assistance to eligible disaster survivors who have a continuing need for shelter after the shelters have been closed because they are unable to return to their homes for an extended period. This initiative is intended to provide short-term lodging for eligible disaster survivors whose communities are either uninhabitable or inaccessible due to disaster-related damages. TSA is funded under Section 403 of the Stafford Act and is subject to a state cost share. The state may request that FEMA authorize the use of TSA for the declared disaster in specific geographic areas. Initial period of assistance is about 5 to 14 days and may be extended if necessary. It's going to cover the cost of the room and taxes. It does not cover incidental room charges or amenities such as phone, room service, or food. Individuals and households may be eligible for TSA if they register with FEMA for assistance, they pass identification verification, their pre-disaster primary residence is located in a geographic area that is designated for TSA, and occupancy is verified, and as a result of the disaster, they are displaced from their pre-disaster residence and are currently not living in their primary residence. Interim housing is intended to provide a safe and sanitary temporary dwelling unit until a family can return to their pre-disaster residence or until other permanent arrangements are made. This may last anywhere from a month to about 18 months or longer, depending upon a variety of factors, including the economic vulnerability of the family, the degree of damage to the home, and the speed with which long-term housing recovery assistance strategies can be implemented. Interim housing can take a variety of forms, including repairs that can be accomplished quickly to damaged dwellings, cash payments for rental assistance, and a range of approaches which include manufactured housing or other readily fabricated dwellings. One of the more creative ideas to emerge in this hectic and tragic days following Hurricane Katrina was the invention of the Katrina cottages, which is a photo of above, a sturdier and more attractive alternative to the FEMA trailers typically used to house displaced residents. The cottages are prefabricated and modular, and they can be constructed on-site or placed on wheels and transported like conventional mobile homes. However, they are designed so that they can be anchored in place to become a fixed, permanent housing option. Moving into long-term or permanent housing is constituted by an individual returning home and regaining self-sufficiency after a disaster event. After a catastrophic event, a return to their pre-event home is not always a guarantee, as there may be situations that will preclude reconstruction of damaged housing at original locations, such as long-term site contamination. In cases where a significant amount of the population is displaced from their homes, a community must consider long-term solutions to resolve the housing crisis. Where land is available, there may be opportunities to encourage rebuilding of housing stock with modular and or stick-built construction. Rapid development requires greater effort by the public, the state, and the federal government. So this isn't a complete list of grants that can be applied for or used. We're just highlighting the ones that are referenced in this framework document. During catastrophic aftermath, the strategic application of the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG, is a supplemental program funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that can be provided for unmet disaster housing needs of affected individuals and permit reconstruction of the community. It is one of the longest continuously run programs at HUD. HUD provides flexible grants to help cities, counties, and states recover from presidentially declared disasters, especially in low-income areas subject to availability of supplemental appropriations. In response to presidentially declared disasters, Congress may appropriate additional funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program as disaster recovery grants to rebuild the affected areas and provide crucial seed money to start the recovery process. Since CDBG disaster recovery assistance may fund a broad range of recovery activities, HUD can help communities and neighborhoods that otherwise might not recover due to limited resources. Other agencies that could provide funding to recovery include the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who works closely with agencies across the federal government to prepare for and respond to emergencies, hazards, outbreaks, or other incidents, while other programs include nutrition assistance, landowner, farmers, ranchers, and producers assistance, housing assistance, and community utility assistance. I'm not spending a long time on the grants. We do have the panel of Bridging the Gap, and Bill Duray will be there, and he has done extensive research on both the National Disaster Recovery Framework as well as a lot of the HUD reference materials. So I'm going to leave that to him to discuss during his panel session. Are there any questions so far at this point? I just want to break enough in between topics in case there's anything anybody wants to add to it, comment on. Okay. So I'm not going to go into detail on every single role and responsibility. Instead, I'm going to highlight some of the roles under each one. Each of these are listed out in the framework, which you'll get a copy of, and I'm sure people probably could add to each list, but it's really just to give everyone an idea of who is involved in the housing and recovery process and the types of responsibilities offices within your locality, region, and across the state can assist with. Also, local government structures will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as do the responsibilities for carrying out these tasks and performing certain roles. So the ones we will cover may not reflect the exact structure in your locality. However, what is important is that the functions described are addressed by the appropriate department or agency within your local government. The first group we will start with is individuals. Individuals are responsible for researching, purchasing, and maintaining appropriate homeowners or renters insurance and adequate levels of insurance for the potential hazards in their area, and identify their needs for short-term sheltering, interim and long-term housing if damage or total loss of their home should occur. Chief Administrative Officers should appoint a recovery coordinator and assign responsibility for housing recovery, including undertaking damage assessments, development of the post-disaster action plan for housing recovery, and ensuring the identification and creation of capabilities required for implementing long-term housing recovery. Chief Administrative Officers should convene a housing recovery task force to provide coordination among government departments and agencies in developing and implementing a long-term housing recovery strategy program. They also make necessary housing decisions using a long-term planning strategy, and then are responsible for the implementation of the options post-disaster. CAOs authorize advanced planning for housing needs based on the various hazards in their jurisdiction, and they're also responsible for coordinating with the local governing body to remove any regulatory barriers to reconstruction. Emergency managers will need to engage their community, establish information and referral services, coordinate interdepartmental planning, organize and integrate local capabilities and resources with neighboring jurisdictions, the state, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and the federal government. They are responsible for assisting public and private sector infrastructure owners who are responsible for water and sewer, public transportation, schools, utilities. Public safety serves to coordinate infrastructure and public safety services in conjunction with the establishment of immediate and long-term housing options. Emergency managers should be an advocate for hazard-resistant housing for all income level groups and special needs populations living in disaster-prone areas, and act as a catalyst with responsible local partners to develop and maintain baseline housing information needed to implement disaster recovery strategies. Emergency managers will also need to engage the community and non-governmental organizations in pre-disaster planning to meet both interim and long-term housing needs of their community, establish information and referral services for disaster victims to community resources and organizations that will provide them with additional support. And they're also responsible for coordinating interdepartmental planning to identify potential housing assistance needs. Local housing agencies are going to be responsible for participating with lead community partners in collaborative efforts to identify potential housing solutions pre-disaster. They should assist with the development of the baseline housing data, including inventories of housing stock and information for potential location for interim housing communities. And following a disaster, local housing agencies should participate in the short-term and long-term housing recovery planning efforts. Planning and zoning are going to be responsible for assisting in identifying areas that may be zoned or rezoned for residential use, single-family housing, accessory housing, and multifamily housing to meet post-disaster housing demands. They're going to identify policy or procedure variances or waivers that are necessary in the post-disaster environment. This is to encourage the rapid reconstruction of the community and accommodate interim housing disasters. Planning and zoning are going to ensure that there's an adequate number of trained building inspectors, use existing local resources, and develop mutual aid agreements for the use of regional, state, or national resources. And they're also going to need to coordinate with homeowners regarding the repair or rebuilding requirements of structures post-disaster. Parks and Recreation are going to be responsible for identifying open space available for locating temporary housing and explore permitting and zoning issues relative to utilizing green space for temporary housing. Finance departments are going to be responsible for evaluating the financial impact and ability to finance interim and long-term housing recovery efforts. The roles and responsibilities of the Commonwealth of Virginia include providing state resources and identifying or requesting federal resources that are available for developing permanent housing. The state is responsible for providing resources for the enforcement of building codes and mitigation of flood and other risks where appropriate. The state will also take on the role of conduit for federal programs that aid permanent housing recovery. VDEM's role in housing recovery is to establish guidelines, policies, and procedures that aim at increasing collaboration, cooperation, and consistency in statewide short-term, interim, and long-term housing planning and operations. VDEM will also assist with the development of grant applications for long-term recovery planning and coordinate efforts with local governments and other state agencies. Leading the State Disaster Housing Task Force and the development of the State Community Development Block Grant Action Plan is the responsibility of the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. The Virginia Housing Development Authority is responsible for providing access to free, real-time, statewide housing locator services. The Virginia Housing Development Authority will conduct ongoing intensive landlord outreach and locate available properties, add to and update listings on a regular basis. They're going to conduct pre-event outreach to housing authorities, identify, contact, and train stakeholder agencies, as well as prepare post-event communications on temporary housing. The federal government's role is to work with local and state governments, organizations, and others in the coordination with the National Disaster Housing Task Force and Joint Housing Solutions Group. The federal government is responsible for identifying strategies and options that address a broad range of disaster housing issues, such as those dealing with planning, zoning, design, production, logistics, codes, and financing. Additional roles include encouraging rapid and appropriate decisions regarding land use and housing locations in the community or within the region, and also identifying gaps in coordination of resolution of conflicting policy and program issues. FEMA is going to be responsible for receiving requests for support from the state and coordinate with other federal departments and agencies to provide the necessary support. Housing support may include rental assistance, repairs, loan assistance, factory-built housing, permanent construction, and accessible housing. In a declared major disaster or emergency under the Stafford Act, FEMA will administer the federal disaster assistance programs that can be used to fund housing recovery, to include the Individual Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Technical Assistance Program. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is responsible for providing housing and housing vouchers via public housing agencies. HUD manages the National Housing Locator, a website that can assist individuals and families in finding rental housing in a presidentially declared or local disaster. HUD offers through the Federal Housing Administration insured mortgages for disaster victims to rebuild substantially damaged or destroyed homes or to rehabilitate less damaged homes. They provide financial assistance to the state and localities through the CDBG program and will provide building technical assistance for housing, community redevelopment, and economic recovery, public services, infrastructure, mortgage financing, and public housing recovery and reconstruction. The Department of Veteran Affairs are going to be responsible for counseling eligible disaster survivors on Virginia housing, and they assign single-family and multiple housing units for the purposes of providing interim housing options to eligible disaster veterans, certain dependents, or beneficiaries of veterans. The Department of Health and Human Services' role in housing recovery is administering grants and wraparound services such as health care, schools and daycare, security, social services maintenance and repair, public transportation and employment counseling. HSS provides subject matter expertise, consultation, and technical assistance on disaster human services issues, such as working with a special needs population. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers supports FEMA's direct housing operations with project management support, technical assistance, or turnkey management of temporary housing unit installations, missions and design, construction, or the deactivation of group sites using these contracts. The Army Corps of Engineers conducts or provides technical assistance on the expedited repair of damaged homes, to include temporary roofing or other repairs that facilitate reoccupation of minimally damaged structures. And the private sector and businesses are going to be responsible for partnering with local emergency management officials to participate in planning, training, and exercises for the provision of goods and services and housing missions. Businesses in the private sector should carry adequate insurance to rebuild damaged facilities and to survive a disruption of work. They should have plans to assist their own employees by providing land for placement of temporary housing, assisting in job placement, or helping them relocate within the company. They are responsible for entering into agreements with local and state governments for technical assistance, goods, and services, and provide these goods and services to support interim housing, either under government contracts or as donations. The nonprofit sector should participate in local and state recovery organizations, engage community leaders to identify community needs, and identify opportunities to support recovery efforts and participate in the local recovery planning. The nonprofit sector is responsible for integrating the mass care services to provide short-term sheltering services and support mass care services in both interim and long-term housing operations. They should assist local and state emergency agencies in determining sheltering requirements, provide shelter guidance and assistance, and implement shelter agreements. Nonprofits can provide volunteer labor, expertise, loans, grants, training or technical assistance, and other resources for building or rebuilding housing, especially affordable housing. Now, I know that was a lot thrown at everyone. Does anyone have questions on the roles and responsibilities in the context of the framework document? Okay. So after discussing these roles and responsibilities, we're going to discuss the regional perspective and strategy of housing recovery. Disaster housing and community redevelopment following a catastrophic event are an inherent function of local governments, aided and assisted by elements of both the state and federal governments. Decisions that are made regarding post-disaster housing have a profound impact on the long-term character and viability of the communities. While these decisions are best made by the local jurisdictions, there is also an important regional element that needs to be considered. Local stakeholders, represented by the Hampton Roads Regional Catastrophic Planning Team, have developed and agreed upon the following core regional values. The Hampton Roads region is committed to enabling recovery within the region for all members of the community. Decisions and implementation will occur at the local level, but there is a need for a regional forum to discuss housing issues and to ensure housing program continuity to the greatest extent possible. The very nature of post-disaster housing requires regional collaboration because jurisdictions are interdependent upon one another because of the fluidity of housing and employment across the region. Housing demand will outstrip the available housing stock in any one jurisdiction, and housing is a highly visible public topic that requires collaboration and information shared. Each jurisdiction will determine from a range of housing program options which ones are going to be best suited to serve the needs of their local communities. The region will also strive to integrate hazard mitigation and resiliency into all housing options. The quality of regional recovery and disaster housing program success will be dependent on timely decision-making by local leaders and disaster housing stakeholders. So now we're going to move into the concept of operations in the context of the housing recovery framework. Each jurisdiction pre-event is going to be responsible for establishing a local disaster housing working group, which will include representatives from agencies identified in the roles and responsibilities we just discussed. They're going to want to gather baseline data as defined in Appendix A, which is the baseline housing data. They're going to set locality-specific objectives and strategies that are going to serve as a starting point for an event-specific disaster housing plan. And then to discuss how in their jurisdiction they would address the critical decision points, which we will discuss later. Appendix A is a template that will be used to gather the baseline data pre-event. It includes collection of demographics, which of course includes age, income, access and functional needs population, pets, ownership versus renter, and their insurance status. The housing stock data includes single-family, multifamily, low-rise, multifamily, high-rise, manufactured housing, the physical characteristics, residential financing, number of housing starts in a given year, the number of renovations and repair permits in a given year, and housing developments that are currently under construction, and their rental vacancy rates within their jurisdiction. They're also going to collect information regarding the impact of the selected scenarios, overlaid with the demographics and housing stock data. Also, some of the community characteristics include the land use, zoning, building codes, permit process, and the construction resources. Additional additional concept of operations pre-event include refining the roles and responsibilities based on the critical decision points. The local disaster housing recovery working group will meet biannually to update the data and review local goals and objectives, and also build a consensus on planning questions and develop working relationships. The Regional Catastrophic Disaster Housing Working Group also meets biannually to update the data, share best practices or lessons learned, and develop working relationships. The role of the Regional Catastrophic Disaster Housing Working Group is to facilitate communication regarding local disaster housing plans and coordinate regional input to the state-led Disaster Housing Task Force. This gives a unified voice on the regional values and priorities. The Regional Working Group will review and validate the regional values and priorities annually, and they will also identify issues such as emergency workforce housing, utilization of the Department of Defense resources that would be best addressed at a regional level. Now, post-event, local officials will activate the local disaster housing working group. They will meet to develop an event-specific disaster housing plan, which uses the pre-event baseline data and the template Appendix C, which is the site selection criteria for immediate housing solutions. At their first meeting, they're going to set a schedule for plan development and assignment of responsibilities for writing the plan. The state-led Disaster Housing Task Force will then notify the chair of the Regional Catastrophic Disaster Housing Working Group, which will activate the Regional Working Group. At their first meeting, the Regional Working Group will set a schedule for the coordination of meetings and conference calls. The purpose of the conference calls will be to coordinate decision-making, allocate resources, and provide regional awareness post-event. So the Regional Catastrophic Disaster Housing Working Group also may address the following issues, which includes identifying opportunities to implement housing recovery programs on a sub-regional or regional level, which would increase program efficiency and effectiveness. An example would be STEP, which is FEMA's Sheltering and Temporary Essential Power Program. The working group is going to develop regional messaging on housing recovery, so citizens understand what programs are available to them and why there may be differences among jurisdictions. They may also develop a regional contractor registry. The working group is going to coordinate regional needs regarding case management and provide scopes of work or contracting guidance to ensure consistency across the region, and to also develop memorandums of understanding to allow for sharing of inspectors or permitting staff resources. Cheryl, I see your question about will the housing stock data include accessibility? That I don't know the answer to, but that will be a fantastic follow-up question for either your local emergency manager, or we can also get that as one of the questions for the speakers, how they address that need in their housing data. Good question. So the disaster housing recovery process can be viewed as a continuum that's going to start with a sheltering phase and then move gradually to interim and then long-term or permanent housing. Different households will move through this continuum at different rates of speed. How long it takes a survivor household to move from a shelter to interim housing to long-term housing will depend upon several factors, such as whether or not they are a renter or a homeowner, the extent of insurance coverage, and the ability for them to call on personal assets or qualify for new loans, and the impact of redevelopment requirements such as floodplain management regulations. During both the interim and long-term phases of housing recovery, numerous critical decisions will determine the outcome of the key mission or the housing mission key decisions that will be faced. So some critical decisions regarding program design is deciding who will be responsible for decisions related to the allocation of supplemental funding. Each community will receive CDBG disaster funds, will be required to submit an action plan that specifies how funding will be used, who will qualify for the assistance, and how eligibility decisions will be made, and how the program will be delivered and managed to ensure financial accountability. They're going to determine the mechanisms to be used to administer disaster-specific programs at the state or Commonwealth local level. So we did discuss interim housing earlier. One of the critical decision points will be selecting interim housing options that are going to be cost-effective, efficient, and timely based on geography, climate, and availability or rehabilitated infrastructure. The following are options to consider, and this goes into more detail in Appendix B, which is the event-specific catastrophic disaster housing plan template. This includes hotel-motel space. Decisions include deciding if and how financial assistance will be provided. Will you use vouchers or use direct payment? Some of the rapid housing, minimal and or temporary repairs. Decide if a program should be used. If yes, develop the scope and prioritization process. Are there existing programs for rapid repair? And determine if muck-out or cleanup services will be provided in the screening process of these recipients. Decisions regarding rental of existing housing units. Deciding if and how financial assistance will be provided and for how long it will be provided. The decisions on conversion of residential or military barracks, dormitories, or commercial buildings. Got to identify suitable properties and assess if these require improvements along with potential funding for these repairs. Any government and privately held, foreclosed, or real estate owned properties. Identify these properties and property managers and owners. Rapid construction of temporary housing. Determine the criteria to qualify for this type of housing. Consider the types to be used, whether it will be modular, Katrina cottages, trailers, and the sites for these homes. And relocation programs. Jurisdiction is going to have to identify these properties, decide how far they are willing to relocate people, and what are the policies and procedures to ensure service is delivered to relocated people. Critical decisions related to permanent housing will include determining which, if any, of the sheltering measures or interim housing options can be transitioned into permanent housing solutions. Consider the availability of wraparound services such as transportation, education, social services, and employment. Decide if the acquisition and rehabilitation of blighted properties is an option. You're going to also have to make decisions if a permanent relocation is necessary for part of the population. How is that going to be implemented? For example, while funding may be available for elevating damaged housing to meet the floodplain management requirements, certain parts of the region experience flooding of roadways with limited access to neighborhoods periodically, a problem that is expected to worsen as sea levels rise. If a decision is made to disinvest in certain areas, you're going to have to use buyout and relocation assisted for affected property owners. You're going to have to take into consideration both environmental and historic preservation requirements, develop a process for expedited environmental review of temporary housing sites, and then consider if funding should be made available for repair and reconstruction in certain hazardous areas, in particular residential properties that experience substantial damage from flooding, and that would have to be elevated as part of the reconstruction. Land use critical decision points include coordinating decisions with existing or developing long-term recovery plans, determining how the existing comprehensive plan should be used to guide recovery, and if there is suitable land for site development and the impact on the housing timeline. Additional critical decision points include identifying zoning regulations that may affect recovery, along with potential changes and how they can be made. For example, does chief elected officials have the authority to change them post-disaster? Should temporary zoning variances be made to allow for manufactured homes in certain areas? Additional critical decisions regarding land use is identifying areas suitable for future habitation, areas that are uncontaminated and less risky. Decide if a phased rehabilitation plan is necessary. This is something that may be necessary in the case of the anthrax release, one of the scenarios that was chosen that we discussed earlier. If there is a remediation needed, and if they will have to decide how they want to do that in geographic phases. Determine to what extent the public needs to be involved in the planning or regulation changes. Develop processes to identify and address abandoned properties, and also identify, again, required environmental reviews at the federal, state, and local level. Critical decisions regarding inspection, building, permitting, and temporary permit and suspension include determining the impact of state and local codes, permitting procedures on the housing timeline, identify changes to the permitting or inspection process, such as temporary housing permits, waivers for certain items or fees, standardized processes, inspections and checklists that should be made to expedite rebuilding, accessing the capability of the jurisdiction for inspections and permitting, and coordinating with other jurisdictions within the region and state to provide mutual aid. Going to assess whether there are adequate resources to mark utility lines, identify specific redevelopment standards that could and should be adopted post-disaster, and develop process for evaluating non-compliant structures specific to disaster redevelopment standards, identify or assign responsibility for evaluating and implementing elevation requirements, and insurance programs into building codes, permits, and inspections. You also have to assess whether additional resources are needed to check or proper lead paint and asbestos removal. Okay, before we move on, yes, will a copy of the brief be available to the participants after this meeting? Yes. We are recording this. It'll be posted on YouTube. We'll send out a link. You'll get a PDF of this PowerPoint as well as a PDF of the framework document that we're reviewing. So moving on to your construction critical decision points, these include determining the impacts of availability and access to contractors and supplies to meet the housing timeline. Decide if it's necessary to waive or modify local construction and trade licensing requirements. This is in order to increase the capacity of construction industry to deal with the repair and reconstruction of damaged housing in a timely manner. Decide whether or not to have an approved contractors list created. Identify job training and workforce development programs that are required to support the surge. Determine what work health and safety measures are needed. Develop a registration procedure and verification process for out-of-state contractors, architects, and engineers, and also coordinate with donations and volunteer management to address policies regarding volunteer labor, allowable types of work, and tracking mechanisms for reimbursement. Additional construction critical decisions include determining if there should be incentives for hiring local contractors or small businesses, put in place price stabilization measures that are needed for construction materials, and consider whether bulk purchase contracts are an option, and a policy should also be put into place for salvaged and reclaimed materials. Mitigation critical decisions include reviewing local hazard mitigation plans and identifying the measures in place or that need to be in place to encourage hazard mitigation and promote sustainable rebuilding. Consider the following using expedited permitting or reduced fees to encourage mitigation actions, whether large-scale acquisition or elevation projects are needed, and whether there should be an effort to acquire the blighted properties in your community. Some of the important financial critical decisions include, given the demographic information, identify the likely needs of the affected households based on the demographic information you've collected. Once the financial needs are identified, identify the likely sources, whether it be their private insurance, national flood insurance, Stafford Act programs, small business loans, congressional appropriations such as CDBG, or other things such as housing trust funds. Determine if the jurisdiction should assist with insurance claims processing. Determine the role of the jurisdiction in assisting with the federal assistance programs. Consider whether to make tax relief, such as tax credits or waivers, available to displaced residents, developers, and donors, and processes for doing so. You're going to need to determine what actions could be taken to forestall foreclosures. And given eligibility gaps for the above programs, identify any alternative funding mechanisms that are in place. Decisions made by public information are communicating interim and long-term housing strategies to all parties to ensure reasonable expectations, including identifying if any special formats or translations that are needed within your jurisdiction. Going to develop a strategy to communicate information on the post-disaster permitting process to the public. You're going to have to identify what types of information need to be shared regarding post-disaster permitting. Assign responsibility for communicating information on safe and resilient rebuilding techniques and information on regarding hiring contractors and the types of information that needs to be shared, and decide how the public will be informed about and asked to participate in long-term recovery and housing plan development. Several other critical decisions include determining what existing case management networks can be utilized and how the jurisdiction will provide caseworkers, decide how to address and identify interim housing needs of the relief workers, insurance adjusters, construction workers, and volunteers in your jurisdiction, decide how to address damage to institutional residential settings, and identify if emergency legislation is needed and what should be included to be able to address housing needs resulting from the disaster. Any questions, regarding critical decision points in the framework? Okay. So just to give you a brief overview, we discussed the templates that are included in the framework. Appendix B is that event-specific catastrophic disaster housing plan template, and basically it provides a basic outline for a housing plan. And Appendix C is the site selection criteria for immediate housing. It is a checklist of housing solutions within the Hampton Roads region. The checklist gives people the opportunity to identify the potential sites, assess the land for the installation of temporary housing. It'll identify required site enhancements and actions needed to support installation, and collect critical contact information. So the National Disaster Recovery Framework, we're just going to do a brief overview because, as I said earlier, in our Bridging the Gap between public and private resources, this will be expanded upon. The NDRF is a guide to promote effective recovery, particularly for those incidents that are large-scale or catastrophic. It provides guidance that enables effective recovery support to disaster-impacted states and local jurisdictions. It provides a flexible structure that enables disaster recovery managers to operate in a unified and collaborative manner. It also focuses on how best to restore, redevelop, and revitalize the health, social, economic, natural, and environmental fabric of the community and build a more resilient nation. So some of the key points is each local government is expected to name a local disaster recovery manager, and this person has the primary role of planning and managing all aspects of the community's recovery. It's important to identify who this is in your community and make sure they understand their role in the recovery planning process. The success of recovery planning is almost 100% based on pre-disaster recovery planning. And the NDRF establishes supportive planning and processes only. In other words, the federal and state governments are designated in this document to support the local governments. And that's a link to a brief overview of the document. And then by no means is it a comprehensive list of resources, so additional ones will be listed in the back of the workbook, but this may be beneficial to review prior to the workshop. And then hopefully, since you're on this webinar, you've already registered. However, if you haven't, please do so by Tuesday, May 5th. The recovery workshop will be at Christopher Newport in the second floor ballroom. It'll go from 9 to 4. We can start registering, or registration check-in begins at 8. We will be providing lunch. We have some really fantastic speakers coming in from Monmouth County, New Jersey, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, as well as the Hampton Roads region is pulling together the panel on the Bridging the Gap.